Hi, my love. Welcome back to Cultivate. My name's Brie, and I own April and Fritz, a wedding and event floristry business here in Melbourne, Australia. I'm also a business coach, and I'm really excited to get into this conversation with you today. In the last episode, I shared a little bit about where I've been, why there's been such a big gap between the seasons of the podcast, and what this space is really becoming for florists and creative business owners. So if you haven't had a chance to listen to that, I highly recommend going back. That way, then you'll have a little bit more context for this conversation. But today, I just want to get straight into the work and talk about a pattern that I'm seeing across my own business, but also in my clients' businesses, which is all about what happens before the quote. If you've ever spent 3 hours on a proposal only to get ghosted, there is a very specific moment I want you to pay attention to. But before we get into that, I just want to share that this episode is based on an essay that I wrote on my Substack, which is called The Tall Poppy. If you're not familiar with my Substack, you can find the link in the show notes below. There you can read the full essay if you'd like to go deeper on anything that we're talking about today. And if you've already read the essay, think of this episode as the director's cut. Same core idea, but maybe a little bit more context, a little bit more story, and a little bit more of what I'm actually seeing behind the scenes. So to kick us off, I just want to start with some data that I've seen in the Knots 2026 Real Wedding Study. There's one number in there in particular that really stopped me in my tracks because it explains a lot about why good florists are losing bookings when they should be winning. And so to get us started, I just want to give you a little bit of context. The Knot is a big US-based wedding platform, and it collects a huge amount of information every year from couples about how they planned their weddings, who they booked, when they booked, how many vendors they contacted, what they spent, all of it. If you can imagine, it's kind of like an Easy Weddings Australia equivalent, I suppose. Now, obviously, it's not perfect, but it is one of the better sort of large scale snapshots that we have of how couples are actually behaving in the market right now. And so there are a few points from this study that I actually want to call out because I think they're really important for florists for a few different reasons, which is what we're going to get into in this episode. First, I just want to say something about why I even bother looking at data like this at all. For anybody who doesn't know, I used to work for Google, and a really big part of my role there was looking at the data first before making any kind of big decisions. And so I think that's probably a skill that has really stuck with me as I've kind of moved into floristry, having my own business, all of that good stuff. As florists, we're obviously very creative people, right? And we have a lot of intuition, I would say. So I think as a group, we have a really unique ability to see when something's shifting in the market before we can even really put a label on it or before the data sort of backs it up. So I'm never going to be the one to tell you to ignore your gut. That's just like not my vibe. But there is another side to it, which I personally like to check myself on, and I would encourage you to do too, which is left on its own, this intuition can turn into a story that we tell ourselves to feel better. Think about things like nobody's booking in this economy, right? Everyone's just being cheap right now. While, yes, sometimes that might be true, it's sometimes not the whole picture either. And so I think for me, just looking at the data is one way of staying a little more honest with myself to make sure I'm not getting caught up in the story. So when I'm feeling a certain way and the numbers line up, it just gives me that evidence to make better decisions for my business about where I put my energy, what I change, and what I leave alone. Now, of course, this is obviously just one data set from one part of the world, but I still think it's a useful lens when we're noticing similar patterns in our own inquiries. And one thing that I see florists get wrong about inquiries again and again and again is assuming that the problem is demand, when often the problem is how the demand is behaving, meaning that it's not always that there aren't enough couples out there. Sometimes it's how those couples are behaving, how they're doing things, and how they're moving through decisions that's changed, which we'll come back to in just a moment. Let's start with the big obvious thing. Bookings feel different, right? Couples are reaching out to more vendors in each category than what they used to. And couples are shopping differently, right? They're reaching out to more vendors, they're collecting more quotes, and they're running more comparisons. So where a florist may have previously been, let's just say, one of two options, now they want a four, which means that you might be having more conversations, sending more proposals, and still not seeing that reflected in your bookings, at least not in the way that you expect, or maybe in the way that you're used to. So I guess what I'm trying to say is if you are sending more proposals than you used to and having more conversations with couples, but your calendar feels quieter than it should be, you're not imagining it. And I think what has been the most interesting thing to me isn't the shift in the buyer behavior itself. It's how we as florists have responded to it. So as I said, I'm in quite a unique position in having my own business and obviously coaching other florists in theirs. And there are a few patterns that I've noticed, but one of the more important ones is that when bookings feel harder to secure, most of us go looking somewhere in our business to regain some sense of control, which is a completely normal human experience, right? But for florists specifically, that usually looks like revisiting your templates or rewriting your proposal documents so that they look a little bit different or feel a little bit different, or building a new workflow, or spending another afternoon in Canva just like moving boxes around, which, of course, for the record, I am absolutely guilty of as well. So are you over systemizing? Probably. Most high achieving florists are. To be fair, the logic makes a lot of sense because if couples are comparing more florists, you want your proposal and your process to look and feel like they stand out, right? And of course, there are benefits to doing this. A clear proposal makes it so much easier for a couple to understand your pricing. A strong guide can answer questions before they're even asked. And better systems can obviously remove any friction from the overall booking process, which are all very good things. But I think that there's a difference between work that makes a marginal improvement and work that fundamentally changes how many of those inquiries are converting into bookings. And in a market where, you're suddenly one of 4 instead of one of 2, that difference really matters. Because at a certain point, we have to ask ourselves if the time we're taking to invest in making these things better is actually paying off. Is it creating the impact that we want it to make? Because at a certain point, the proposal is doing its job. The guide is doing its job. The workflow is doing its job. And so continuing to work on them can feel super productive, yes, but it doesn't fundamentally change how a couple perceives you because it's only one part of the booking process that it impacts. Now, do not get me wrong. I am a huge fan of how things look and feel and, making sure that we're giving the right information at the right time and in the right way. But also, I'm a perfectionist, so I know how easy it is to just keep going and going and going on something and then look up, 5 hours later and it's really not made much difference to the business itself. So I'm not talking about the moments where you're making smart improvements and significant improvements that will actually make a really big difference. I'm talking about the moments where the tweaks are so minor and the impact on the buying decision is so minimal that it really doesn't make a difference. And when I say it doesn't really make a difference, what I mean is it doesn't really affect whether the booking was won or lost. And that's because that's basically already decided before your quote ever lands. So today I want to get into another skill where if you spent that same amount of time, it would make a much bigger impact on your bookings. And that is the way that you run your consultations. We know that buyers rarely make decisions on information alone, right? We are social and emotional beings. We take information in, yes, but then we filter it through our perceived trust, credibility, the experience that we've had of the business up until that point. So unlike a proposal, which influences just a single touch point, your consultation skills basically shape every touch point thereafter. And this is where the data comes into play and is really, really important because more than half of the couples, 52%, told the knot that responsiveness and the way that a vendor communicates with them is a key part of whether they choose to trust them to book or not. More than half. Not the portfolio, not the price, nothing like that. How they communicate. And so that data alone makes it worth reviewing our consultations, doesn't it? So what I've been asking myself and what I would invite you to ask yourself as well is if couples are comparing more florists than ever before, and if the way that we communicate has such a strong influence on whether they actually feel ready to book with us, why are so many intelligent, capable, very talented florists still investing a disproportionate amount of time and energy on the back-end systems? Now, I have a few theories, but fundamentally, I think part of the answer is that systems are just a lot easier to look at critically than ourselves. A proposal is tangible, isn't it? You can compare the versions, see the before and after, admire your progress that you've made it look a little bit better, and you really just have something to show for it at the end of the day. Whereas consultation skills are different, right? To get better conversations, you have to look at how you listen, where you interrupt, how you talk about money, where you rush, where you avoid, and that is a much more vulnerable kind of work. So in a second, I'll talk about how I define consultation skills. But before we go there, I think it's really important that we acknowledge why they're so uncomfortable to look at. It's uncomfortable to review your performance in consultations because it asks you to examine patterns, behaviors that you've been potentially running for years, like the way that you soften your language when you talk about budget, or the way that you fill every single silence, or the way that you downplay your thoughts just in an effort to get the booking. Now, the thing is, none of that shows up on a proposal, but it does shape how a couple will experience your proposal. So if we're doing all of this reflection on our communication and our sales skills, the natural next question becomes, what actually makes a good consultation? Most people would say, well, obviously the goal is to get the booking. And yes, of course, we want them to say yes to working with us. That is obvious. But most florists stop there. They think a good consultation is just a booking. That's it. Whereas I think about getting the booking as a byproduct of a good consultation. So to me, consultation skills are really about your ability to adapt to the client in front of you. Because in my experience, the more skillfully and flexibly that you can do that, the more naturally the yes from the couple tends to arrive. Let me explain a little bit about what I mean. So a good consultation might be that you are adjusting the questions that you ask because the couple are more detail oriented and they need a little bit more structure. Or a good consultation might be that you slow it right down because the couple are clearly overwhelmed and need help making sense of what actually matters to them. You might spend more time on inspiration with one couple and more time on logistics with another. And so the bones of your consultations are the same, but the way that you show up within it changes depending on the person in front of you. And so when I think about consultation skills, communication, sales, however it is that you want to label it, I see them on a spectrum. At one end, you have developing, and at the other end, it's advanced. And most florists sit somewhere on that spectrum. So it's not like you have the skill or you don't. You already have some form of communication skills. You already have some sort of sales skills. It's more that, most people have never stopped to ask if this is a skill set that they need to actually develop because that's not something we're taught in floristry school. But let me put it this way. You already know what an off consultation feels like, don't you? We've all had that interaction with someone where, you walk away feeling unsure. There's a particular sort of texture to it compared to the other conversations where you just both know that it landed. And so when you really dig into that, we can see the skills that made it good or not. We're talking about things like listening, questioning, leadership, trust building. These are the skills that shape how a person experiences you through an interaction. And so my approach to consultation skills is to focus on improving the quality of the conversation that leads to a decision rather than pushing the person towards a decision like the old school sales tactics would have you do. Because again, in my experience, when you improve the skills that improve the quality of your consultation, the bookings just tend to follow. So in thinking about it this way, every proposal that you send should really just be like a receipt of a conversation that you already feel is booked in. And so hopefully at this point, you can start to see that at the end of the day, couples don't book proposals, they book interactions. So the next time a couple chooses someone else, the most useful question might not be, how can I improve my workflow or proposal or email template? If a couple chooses someone else, instead of jumping into Canva, maybe get curious about the conversation that you had. I mentioned earlier that there's one question that I always come back to with this, which is, what actually happened in that consultation that may have led the couple to the decision that they did? And when I've gone back and looked at my own consultations over the years, I've noticed that there's always these little clues in the conversation, like, yeah, I missed that thing that they said there, or I didn't, pick up on that cue, or, I really rushed through that when I shouldn't have. So I just want to invite you to get curious around your consultations and just know that you don't have to fix everything at once. You can literally just choose one moment from that review and decide that you're going to handle it differently next time. That's how easy it gets to be. And if there's anything more that you would like to dive into, you can head to the essay, which is on my Substack, The Tall Poppy. I'll leave the link in the show notes for you below. And if this is the kind of conversation that you enjoy, feel free to send it to your florist friend because they might just benefit from it too. So thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next week.